a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. The rhythmic crunch of a gravel truck grinding to a halt shattered the afternoon stillness. A smirk stretched across the HOA president's face, eyes gleaming with petty triumph as a torrent of jagged stones cascaded, not onto his property, but onto theirs. Their land, their dreams, buried under a landslide of spite. But as despair threatened to consume the young couple, a flicker ignited in the old man's eyes, a silent, mischievous resolve, and somewhere, a pool liner unknowingly shuddered. The afternoon sun, usually a welcome guest in Sarah Miller's meticulously kept garden, now cast harsh shadows across a scene of utter devastation. A mountain of sharp gray gravel, easily 10 cubic yards of it, sat like a malignant tumor on the edge of her property, spilling over the pristine grass where her petunias had blossomed just hours before. The vibrant fuchsia petals were now crushed, dust-covered casualties beneath the coarse, unyielding rock. Sarah stood frozen, a half-filled watering can still clutched in her hand, the water slowly dripping onto the already saturated soil. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and rising fury. It wasn't just the gravel, it was the audacious, sneering act of it. This wasn't an accident. This was a statement. Across the meticulously trimmed lawn of the house next door, Richard Maxwell, the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, stood with his arms crossed, a thin, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his polo shirt ironed to crisp perfection. He looked like the picture of suburban contentment, a picture that grated on Sarah's last nerve. "Afternoon, Mrs. Miller," he called out, his voice dripping with false pleasantness. "Lovely day for a delivery, wouldn't you say?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Maxwell, what in God's name is this?" Her voice trembled, a mixture of rage and burgeoning tears. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves. "Just a little improvement project, dear. For the common area, it seems a touch of the gravel found its way onto your side of the property line. Accidents happen, you know." He gestured vaguely with a manicured hand, as if a 10-ton heap of rock was a mere pebble that had harmlessly rolled astray. Accident? Tom, Sarah's husband, emerged from their garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. His eyes, usually warm and reassuring, hardened as he took in the scene. He was a man of logic, a software engineer who believed every problem had a solution, but even he looked utterly baffled by the sheer scale of the disruption. "Richard, that pile is practically in our living room. You can't just dump construction materials here." "Ah, but I can, Thomas," Maxwell countered, his smile widening, revealing perfectly aligned, unnervingly white teeth. "It's the common area," clearly marked, "and as HOA president I deem this spot most convenient for storage until the landscaping team arrives next week." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over their property, lingering on the small patch of earth Sarah had just begun to clear for their new patio. "Unless, of course, your little project is encroaching on HOA property. We wouldn't want that, would we? Very strict rules about unauthorized landscaping." Sarah felt a cold dread creep through her. This wasn't just about gravel. This was about their dream, their sanctuary. For months, she and Tom had meticulously planned their backyard patio, a small oasis where they could finally relax after years of saving and working. They'd filed all the necessary permits with the HOA, gotten approval for the design, and even had a signed letter from Maxwell himself. They'd done everything by the book. But Maxwell was the book, and he seemed intent on rewriting chapters as he went along. "We have all the approvals, Richard," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "You signed off on our plans just last month." "Plans? Yes. But perhaps the execution is a touch ambitious," Maxwell purred. his eyes narrowing slightly. A few too many exotic plants for a common area adjacency. And this new retaining wall you're planning, very close to the official boundary, it makes this spot quite ideal for storage. He winked, a gesture so overtly malicious it stole Sarah's breath. Tom stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides. You're doing this on purpose, Richard. Because of the fence. The air crackled. The fence was an old grudge. 3 months ago, the Millers had installed a new privacy fence along their shared property line. It was perfectly within code, but it blocked Maxwell's view of their yard, a view he apparently considered his birthright. He'd thrown a fit, demanding it be moved. They'd refused, politely but firmly, citing HOA regulations and property deeds. He'd backed down, but the festering resentment had clearly found a new outlet. Maxwell's smile didn't falter, but a subtle tension tightened his jaw. The fence was a regrettable aesthetic choice, Thomas, but purely your prerogative, of course. This gravel, however, is a matter of common property maintenance, and I assure you it will remain there until the work commences, which, as I said, is next week. He looked at his watch, a heavy gold timepiece. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting. He turned and walked back to his house, his gait unhurried, almost theatrical, as if he were exiting a stage after a triumphant performance. The sight of him disappearing into his perfectly manicured home, leaving behind a mountain of disruption and despair, sent a fresh wave of helplessness over Sarah. "Next week?" she whispered, staring at the gravel. "He knows our contractor is coming on Monday. How are they supposed to work around this?" Tom put an arm around her, pulling her close. "We'll figure it out, hun. We'll call the HOA. We'll fight this." His voice, however, lacked its usual certainty. He knew, as Sarah did, that Maxwell effectively was the HOA. He'd cultivated loyal allies on the board, manipulated rules, and intimidated dissenters for years. From the porch swing, Grandpa Joe watched the entire exchange. Joe Miller, a man built from the grit and resilience of a generation that knew what real hardship was, sat motionless, his gnarled hands resting on his knees. He was pushing 80, his silver hair thin, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. He had moved in with Sarah and Tom a year ago after a minor stroke, finding solace in their quiet suburban life, though he often mused about the softness of modern living. He'd observed Maxwell's petty reign for months, the way he nitpicked, gossiped, and wielded his power like a blunt instrument. He'd seen the tension build over the fence, the garden plans. He'd said little, mostly listening, occasionally offering a cryptic grunt of disapproval. But now, as he watched the light die in Sarah's eyes, saw Tom's frustrated helplessness, something stirred within him. The sight of his granddaughter, who had always been so bright and full of life, wilting under the weight of such an overt act of malice, struck a chord deep inside his weathered chest. He saw the gravel as more than just rocks. It was an act of bullying, a deliberate assault on their peace. "He thinks he's a king," Grandpa Joe rumbled, his voice hoarse from disuse, breaking the silence. Sarah turned, startled, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "He acts like it, Grandpa. What are we going to do? The contractor will charge us a fortune if he has to move all this." Grandpa Joe slowly pushed himself off the swing, his joints creaking. He walked with a slight shuffle, but his gaze was steady. He approached the mound of gravel, kicking a few stones with his worn boot. The sound was surprisingly loud, grating. "He's got a pool, don't he?" Grandpa Joe asked, his eyes still fixed on the offending pile. Sarah frowned, confused. "Yes, a huge one. Maxwell's always bragging about how pristine it is. He cleans it twice a day, practically." A faint, almost imperceptible glint appeared in Grandpa Joe's eyes. It was a look Sarah hadn't seen in years, a flash of the mischievous, sharp-witted man who used to tell her stories of his youth, of outsmarting conniving neighbors and bullies back in the old neighborhood. He walked around the pile, examining it from different angles, his silence more unnerving than any outburst. "He'll pay for this," Grandpa Joe mumbled. "Not to them, but to the gravel, to the universe." A resolve, cold and hard as the stones themselves, settled deep in his core. He hadn't fought a war for this country, risked his life, and built a family to see them pushed around by a man who measured his self-worth by the neatness of his lawn and the number of rules he could enforce. Sarah and Tom spent the next hour, making calls, their frustration growing with each unanswered phone or bureaucratic dead end. The HOA secretary was out of office. Board members were unavailable, or simply stated, "Richard handles all landscaping matters." It was a brick wall, expertly constructed. As evening fell, casting long shadows that made the gravel pile look even more ominous, Sarah sat on the porch step, head in her hands. "This is hopeless," she sighed, her voice raw. "He's got us, Grandpa." Joe, who had been quietly observing from a distance, slowly approached. He pulled up a small wooden stool and sat beside her. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, he simply reached out and patted her hand, his touch surprisingly firm. "He thinks he's got us cornered, little bird," Grandpa Joe said, his voice softer now, but with an underlying steel. "But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind." He looked towards Maxwell's house, where lights now gleamed, illuminating a perfectly manicured backyard. A faint shimmer of blue was visible. Maxwell's prized crystal-clear swimming pool. Richard Maxwell's scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, a raw, primal sound that cut through the tranquil morning. His face, still contorted in a mask of incandescent fury, was a shade of purple usually reserved for bruised fruit. He stormed to the edge of his now defiled pool, splashing a hand into the murky water, recoiling as the gritty particles coated his fingers. "This is an act of war," he shrieked, his voice cracking with outrage. He spun around, pointing a trembling, gravel-strewn finger at Grandpa Joe. You degenerate! I'll have you arrested. I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood, Grandpa." Joe, still sitting on the porch swing, simply took another slow sip of his coffee. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, played on his lips. "Well, Richard," he drawled, his voice calm amidst the storm, "I just thought I'd return your generosity. You know, a little something for the common good. After all, what goes around comes around." Sarah and Tom, initially stunned into silence, burst into a fit of muffled giggles. The sheer audacity of Grandpa Joe's act, coupled with Maxwell's theatrical meltdown, was too much to bear. "You think this is funny?" Maxwell roared, his eyes darting between the laughing couple and the unflappable old man. "This is criminal! Vandalism! I'll see you bankrupt! I'll see your house foreclosed! You'll regret this day, mark my words!" He snatched his phone from his bathrobe pocket, his thumb jabbing furiously at the screen. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling my lawyer. I'm calling the media." True to his word, within minutes, the cul-de-sac became a hive of activity. A patrol car, its siren mercifully silent, pulled up to Maxwell's curb. Then, an unmarked sedan. And finally, a gleaming black SUV, from which emerged a man in a sharp suit carrying a briefcase, Maxwell's lawyer. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, peered from behind curtains and discreetly watered their lawns, their ears straining to catch every detail of the unfolding drama. Officer Miller, no relation to Sarah's amusement, was a burly man with a perpetually tired expression. He listened patiently as Maxwell, gesticulating wildly, recounted the malicious and premeditated attack on his private property and precious recreational facility. He omitted, of course, any mention of the gravel he had dumped on the Millers' lawn. When it was the Millers' turn, Tom calmly explained the preceding events, pointing to the still sizable pile of gravel on their own property. "He dumped this here yesterday, officer," Tom said, his voice level, "without our permission, claiming it was for common area maintenance, right where our contractor is supposed to start work on Monday. My grandfather simply returned some of it, officer. Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. So, let me get this straight. Mr. Maxwell dumped gravel on your property, and in retaliation, your grandfather dumped some of it into Mr. Maxwell's pool? Grandpa Joe nodded sagely. That about sums it up, son. The officer looked from the gravel in the pool to the gravel on the lawn, then back to the three Millers, who were doing their best to maintain straight faces. He could see the poetic justice, even if it wasn't exactly legal. Maxwell's lawyer, a slick, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Sterling, stepped forward. Officer, this is a clear case of felony vandalism. My client's pool is a significant asset, and the cost of draining, cleaning, and potentially repairing damage from this assault will be astronomical. And the cost of delaying our contractor, Mr. Sterling, Sarah interjected, her voice sharp, and the damage to our garden? Is that not vandalism when Mr. Maxwell does it? The ensuing argument devolved into a legalistic shouting match, with Officer Miller attempting to mediate, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Ultimately, no arrests were made. Officer Miller explained that without clear proof of who exactly dumped the gravel, and given the tit-for-tat nature of the dispute, it was largely a civil matter. He advised both parties to resolve it through the HOA, or failing that, through small claims court. Maxwell, incandescent with rage, vowed vengeance. This isn't over, Millers. Not by a long shot. You haven't seen the last of Richard Maxwell. And he was right. The very next day, a small, official-looking notice appeared on the Millers' front door. It was from the HOA, signed, of course, by Richard Maxwell as president. It cited them for unauthorized storage of construction materials on common property, referring to their remaining gravel pile, failure to maintain proper landscaping standards, a thinly veiled attack on Sarah's slightly wilder, less manicured garden style, and causing a public nuisance, a blanket charge aimed at Grandpa Joe's antics. Each violation carried a hefty fine escalating daily. The letter also stated that if the unauthorized materials were not removed within 24 hours, the HOA would have them removed at the Millers' expense, plus an additional penalty. He's trying to bury us in fines, Tom muttered, staring at the notice. He knows we can't afford to hire a crew to move all this gravel, and our contractor isn't due until Monday. Grandpa Joe just hummed, his eyes still twinkling. More where that came from, eh? The next blow came swiftly. That afternoon, a team of professional landscapers, clearly hired by Maxwell, arrived at his property. They worked with grim efficiency, draining the pool, then using a specialized vacuum system to remove the gravel piece by agonizing piece. It was an expensive, laborious process, and Maxwell stood over them, barking orders, occasionally glaring at the Millers' house. The sight of the process, costly and humiliating for Maxwell, was a small victory for Grandpa Joe, but the cost would undoubtedly be leveraged against them. That evening, Tom received a formal letter from Mr. Sterling, Maxwell's lawyer, demanding immediate compensation for the extensive damages to Maxwell's pool, totaling over $15,000, including cleanup, water replacement, and emotional distress. The letter threatened a lawsuit if payment wasn't received within 72 hours. $15,000, Sarah gasped, her face paling. We don't have that kind of money. We were saving for the patio, for emergencies, not legal battles. Despair, which had briefly lifted with Grandpa Joe's act of defiance, settled heavily back into their home. Maxwell was playing dirty, and he had the resources to do it. Grandpa Joe, however, was not deterred. He sat quietly as Sarah and Tom panicked, discussing options, selling the house, taking out a loan, declaring bankruptcy. He listened to their increasingly frantic arguments, their fear a palpable thing in the room. He knew this wasn't just about money for Maxwell. It was about power, about crushing dissent. He wants to scare you, Grandpa Joe finally said, breaking the silence. He wants you to fold. He wants to win. "He is winning, Grandpa," Tom exclaimed, running a hand through his hair. "He has the money, the lawyers, the HOA behind him. What do we have? A shovel and a grudge." Grandpa Joe's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes a good grudge and a little ingenuity is all you need." He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Does Maxwell have one of those fancy smart thermostats?" Sarah blinked, confused by the sudden change of topic. "A smart thermostat? Like Nest or something?" "Yeah, he brags about controlling his whole house from his phone." "And a sprinkler system?" Grandpa Joe continued, ignoring her confusion. "Automated? The kind that waters his perfect lawn at precisely 4 a.m.? "Yes, but what does that have to do with anything?" Tom asked, exasperated. Grandpa Joe just smiled, a wide, almost childlike grin. "Everything, son, everything." He spent the rest of the evening poring over old blueprints of the Willow Creek estates, ones he'd found tucked away in a dusty box from when Sarah's parents first bought the house decades ago. He studied the network of utility lines, the precise locations of common area access points, the almost invisible easements. He muttered to himself, tracing lines with a gnarled finger, a mischievous glint in his eye. He was no longer just responding to Maxwell's attacks. He was preparing for a counteroffensive, one that would hit Maxwell where it truly hurt. His perfectly controlled, perfectly automated, perfectly smart home. The legal threats, the fines, the escalating costs, they were just background noise to Grandpa Joe. He was playing a different game, and he was just getting started. The stakes were no longer just gravel in a pool. They were about reclaiming their peace, and perhaps teaching a very spoiled HOA president a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. The chill of the evening deepened, but inside Joe Miller, a different kind of heat was steadily building. It wasn't the feverish flush of anger, but the slow, simmering burn of calculation. Sarah and Tom had retreated indoors, exhausted by their fruitless attempts to navigate the HOA's labyrinthine bureaucracy. Their voices, muffled and disheartened, drifted from the living room. Grandpa Joe remained on the porch, his gaze fixed on the faint blue glow emanating from Richard Maxwell's backyard, a beacon of his neighbor's perceived invincibility. "Some things, you just gotta give back," he'd said. The words echoed in, his mind solidifying into a concrete plan. It was audacious, potentially foolhardy, but it pulsed with a raw, satisfying sense of poetic justice. He spent the next few hours in a methodical silence that belied the storm brewing within him. First, he went to the shed. Tom had an impressive array of tools, most of them pristine and rarely used by their owner, who preferred digital problem-solving. Grandpa Joe, however, was a man of the analog world, accustomed to getting his hands dirty. He found what he needed: a sturdy, wide-mouthed shovel, its metal edge still sharp, a durable tarp, crinkled from storage but intact, and a pair of thick work gloves. He tested the shovel's weight, the balance, feeling the familiar heft of honest labor. Next, he surveyed the battleground. The gravel pile loomed under the porch light, a dark, menacing silhouette. 10 cubic yards. That was a lot of rock. Too much to move by hand in one go. But he wasn't planning on moving it all. Just enough to make a point. Just enough to return the favor, with interest. He walked the perimeter of their property, assessing the distance to Maxwell's pool. Not far, maybe 50 feet through the overgrown rose bushes that separated their yards. A natural, if thorny, curtain that Maxwell often complained about, but had never managed to get them to trim to his satisfaction. He ate a quiet dinner with Sarah and Tom, listening to their defeated recounting of phone calls and email drafts. He nodded, grunted occasionally, offering no advice, just the comforting presence of an old man who had seen worse and endured. They, too, consumed by their despair, barely noticed his unusual quietude or the gleam in his eyes. When they finally headed to bed, discouraged and weary, Grandpa Joe simply said, "Sleep tight, kids. Tomorrow's another day." But for Grandpa Joe, tomorrow was beginning tonight. Around midnight, when the neighborhood had settled into a deep, oblivious hush, Grandpa Joe rose from his bed. He moved with a surprising agility for his age, his movements deliberate and silent. He dressed in old work clothes, dark and inconspicuous against the night. He grabbed a strong flashlight, its beam a single, focused eye in the darkness. Outside, the air was cool and still. A sliver of moon hung in the sky, casting a weak, silvery glow that played tricks on the shadows. He approached the gravel pile, its rough texture almost absorbing the meager moonlight. The sheer volume of it seemed daunting, but he focused on the task, breaking it down mentally into manageable chunks. He laid out the tarp carefully, positioning it at the base of the pile, ready to receive its metallic payload. The first scoop of gravel grated against the shovel, a harsh sound in the quiet night. He worked slowly, rhythmically, the movements familiar from a lifetime of digging, hauling, and building. Scoop, lift, dump, scoop, lift, dump. His back ached almost immediately, a dull throb that threatened to spread through his entire frame. But he ignored it. This wasn't about comfort. It was about principle. Each shovelful was a small act of defiance, a silent reclaiming of their peace. He filled the tarp, then carefully gathered its corners, forming a heavy, makeshift sling. Dragging it was harder than he'd anticipated. The sharp edges of the gravel bit into the fabric, and the weight pulled at his arms, threatening to dislocate his shoulders. He gritted his teeth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled, inch by agonizing inch, towards the rose bushes. The thorns tore at his clothes, snagged on the tarp, but he pushed through, driven by an almost primal need for retribution. He reached the edge of Maxwell's perfectly manicured backyard. The fence, their recent battleground, now served as a convenient barrier, obscuring his movements from the street. Beyond it, the pool shimmered, its water a dark, inviting expanse under the stars. It was a tempting target, a symbol of Maxwell's meticulous control and lavish lifestyle. Grandpa Joe knelt, untying the corners of the tarp. With a grunt of effort, he tipped it. The first cascade of gravel hit the water with a soft, muffled splash, like a handful of large stones dropped into a pond. Then came the steady, rhythmic plunk, plunk, plunk as the rest followed, disappearing beneath the surface. The water, so recently pristine, rippled outwards, disturbing the perfect reflection of the moon. He repeated the process, and then again, and again. Each trip back to the gravel pile, each drag across the lawn, each dump into the pool was a testament to his stubborn resolve. His muscles screamed in protest, his breath hitched in his throat, and sweat stung his eyes, but he kept going. He wasn't a young man anymore, his strength was finite, but his will was boundless. He paused only to catch his breath, his eyes fixed on the growing sediment at the bottom of Maxwell's pool, a dark, gritty stain spreading across the shimmering blue. He imagined Maxwell's face in the morning, the HOA president, who fretted over a single fallen leaf in his pool, who boasted about its clarity, who undoubtedly checked it every morning with ritualistic fervor. The thought spurred him on, giving him a renewed burst of energy. By the time the first hint of pre-dawn light began to tint the eastern sky, Grandpa Joe was utterly spent. His body ached in places he didn't even know existed. His hands, despite the gloves, were raw and blistered. His clothes were torn, and a few rose thorns had left angry red welts on his arms. But the gravel pile, though still formidable, was noticeably smaller. And Maxwell's pool, once a picture of serenity, now contained a significant and unmistakable layer of grit at its bottom. The crystal-clear water was murkier, disturbed. He had moved perhaps a third of the original pile, enough to make a very clear, very disruptive statement. He carefully refolded the tarp, put the shovel back in the shed, and wiped down the tools, leaving no trace of his nocturnal activities. He even swept the small path he'd created through the gravel, disguising his efforts. He moved back into the house just as the sun's first rays touched the horizon, slipping into his bed, muscles protesting with every movement. He lay there, eyes closed, listening to the birds begin their morning chorus. The pain was intense, a constant dull ache, but it was overshadowed by a deep, quiet satisfaction. He hadn't just dumped gravel, he had dumped a problem back where it belonged. He had answered an act of malice with a well-aimed dose of chaos. He drifted into a fitful sleep, filled with images of shifting gravel and shimmering blue. The next morning, Sarah and Tom woke up with a sense of lingering dread, the gravel pile still a heavy weight on their minds. Grandpa Joe was already up, sitting on the porch swing, sipping coffee, looking surprisingly serene despite the physical toll of the night. He smiled at them, a small, knowing smile. "Morning, kids," he greeted, his voice a little raspy. "Looks like it's gonna be a clear day." They joined him on the porch, their gazes automatically drawn to the gravel. It was still there, of course, but something felt different. It was subtly smaller. They exchanged a puzzled glance, wondering if their memory was playing tricks on them. Then, from next door, a piercing, guttural shriek tore through the morning air. "No! No! What in the ever-loving hell is this?" It was Richard Maxwell. His voice, usually smooth and modulated, was now a raw, unhinged bellow. Sarah and Tom bolted upright, their eyes wide. Grandpa Joe merely took another sip of his coffee, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of satisfaction passing through him. Maxwell burst out of his back door, clad in nothing but a silk bathrobe, his hair disheveled, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He scrambled to the edge of his pool, staring down into the water, his perfect, pristine blue now an agitated, murky green-gray, the bottom coated in a gritty, unwelcome layer of dark stones. The gravel, the very same gravel he had ordered, dumped on their land, was now comfortably nestled in his prized swimming pool. He screamed again, a sound of pure, impotent fury and disbelief. "My pool! My pool!" He splashed a hand into the water, recoiling as the gritty particles coated his fingers. He looked around wildly, his eyes scanning their yard, then his own, searching for an explanation, a culprit. His gaze landed on the remaining gravel pile in their yard, then darted to Grandpa Joe, who sat calmly on his porch swing, sipping his coffee, a picture of innocent enjoyment. Maxwell's face turned a shade of mottled purple. "You! You did this! You hack!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling, gravel-covered finger at Grandpa Joe. Grandpa Joe met his gaze, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face, a smile that held no malice, only a profound sense of cosmic balance. He raised his coffee cup slightly, a silent toast. Sarah and Tom stood rooted to the spot, their jaws practically on the floor. They looked from the horror-stricken Maxwell to their serene grandfather, and then to the gravel in their yard, then to the gravel in the pool. The connection clicked, and a slow, dawning realization spread across their faces, followed by an explosion of suppressed laughter, bubbling up from the well of... The heavy silence in the Miller household after Tom read Maxwell's lawyer's letter was thick with despair. $15,000. It was a sum that felt insurmountable, a financial guillotine hanging over their dreams. Sarah sat huddled on the sofa, clutching a throw pillow, her eyes red-rimmed. Tom paced, a frantic tiger in a cage, muttering about legal aid and countersuits that felt like hollow hopes against Maxwell's deep pockets. Grandpa Joe, however, was a picture of serene contemplation. The blueprints of Willow Creek Estates were spread across the kitchen table, illuminated by a single focused lamp. He traced lines with a gnarled finger, a faint smile playing on his lips. He wasn't looking at property lines or easements anymore. He was looking for vulnerabilities, for the unseen veins and arteries of Maxwell's perfectly orchestrated life. "He wants to scare you," Grandpa Joe repeated, his voice calm, cutting through their panic. "He wants you to fold. He wants to win." He looked up, his eyes meeting Tom's, sharp and resolute. "But winning ain't always about money, son. Sometimes it's about making the other fellow realize just how much he doesn't control." He pointed to a section of the blueprint. "See this here? Common utility access point, right near the back of Maxwell's property line. Used to be for the old sprinkler system before everyone went smart. But the main line's still there. Buried. Shallow." Tom frowned. "What are you getting at, Grandpa?" "Richard Maxwell, he's a creature of habit, ain't he?" Grandpa Joe mused, ignoring the question. "He likes his lawn watered at precisely 4 a.m., his house cooled to a crisp 72 degrees, his lights on timers, his security system chirping just so." He tapped the blueprint. "Everything's connected now, ain't it? All controlled by them? Fancy apps." A wicked gleam entered Grandpa Joe's eyes. "Well, what if those connections got a little confused?" The following night, under the shroud of a moonless sky, Grandpa Joe embarked on his next mission. This wasn't about brute force. It was about precision, about targeting the psychological weak points of a man who thrived on control and order. He took Tom's smallest, most delicate set of tools, the kind used for intricate electronics, along with a roll of heavy-duty electrical tape. He moved with the quiet stealth of an old hunter. The common utility access point was exactly where. The blueprints indicated a small, unassuming metal plate half hidden by overgrown weeds at the very back of Maxwell's property, just inside the common area. It was almost perfectly positioned between their fence and the wall of Maxwell's immaculate garage, out of sight from prying eyes. Working quickly, his flashlight beam a narrow tunnel in the darkness, Grandpa Joe pried open the access panel. Inside, a spiderweb of old wires and newer color-coded cables lay exposed. He'd done his research. He'd spent hours online, watching YouTube tutorials on smart home systems and how they connected to older infrastructure, mentally mapping out the vulnerabilities. He wasn't looking to destroy anything, merely to reroute. He located the main power lines leading to Maxwell's outdoor systems, the sprinkler controller, the pool pump, the exterior lighting. With a pair of small, insulated wire cutters, he made a series of precise snips. Then, with an almost surgical touch, he began to re-splice and re-tape, cross-connecting certain lines, intentionally miswiring others. He wasn't creating a short circuit, just a chaotic symphony of misdirection. He rerouted the sprinkler system's low-voltage trigger to the pool pump's primary power. He linked the exterior light sensor to the air conditioning unit's power supply. It was a delicate, intricate dance of wires, a silent, unseen sabotage. He finished just as the first faint hint of pre-dawn light began to touch the horizon. He carefully replaced the access panel, concealing it perfectly, leaving no trace of his nocturnal tinkering. He slipped back into his house, his joints aching, but his heart singing with a mischievous glee. He didn't have to wait long for the results. At precisely 4 a.m., the Millers were jolted awake by a cacophony of sound. From Maxwell's backyard came the unmistakable roar of his pool pump, normally a quiet hum, now working overtime, accompanied by the hiss and spray of his automatic sprinklers. But they weren't watering the lawn. They were spraying directly into the already emptied, gravel-stained pool. "What in the world?" Sarah mumbled, rubbing her eyes as Tom sat bolt upright in bed. Then came another sound, a high-pitched, insistent whine. It was Maxwell's air conditioning unit, kicking into overdrive, its hum vibrating through the silent morning. Simultaneously, the powerful floodlights in Maxwell's backyard, designed to deter intruders, flickered on, bathing the cul-de-sac in an unnatural, blinding glare. "Oh my God," Tom whispered, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Grandpa." Minutes later, a new enraged shriek ripped through the air, even more frantic than the last. Richard Maxwell, roused from his sleep by the blaring lights and roaring machinery, burst out of his house in his silk bathrobe once more. He stood on his patio, his hair a wild mess, staring in bewildered horror at his now refilling sprinkler-doused pool and his brightly lit, overcooled house. He tried frantically to pull up his smart home app on his phone, but the systems, cross-wired by Grandpa Joe, were in a state of chaotic rebellion. The app showed everything working perfectly, yet the reality was a hydroelectric nightmare. He stumbled around, flipping light switches that did nothing, hitting the thermostat that only seemed to make the AC unit whine louder. The sprinklers continued to spray water directly into his empty pool, already filled with the fresh layer of gravel he'd just paid a fortune to remove. "What is happening? My power, my water, my control!" he shrieked, his voice dissolving into a frustrated sob. He was losing his mind, a man completely unmoored from the technological certainty that defined his existence. The neighbors, now fully awake and intrigued by the continued commotion, started emerging from their homes, some openly pointing and whispering, others stifling snickers. The sight of the HOA president, a man who prided himself on absolute order, reduced to a shrieking, bewildered mess amidst his own malfunctioning smart home, was a spectacle of epic proportions. Grandpa Joe, meanwhile, was back on the porch swing, sipping his coffee. Sarah and Tom joined him, their faces alight with a mixture of shock, amusement, and a burgeoning sense of triumph. You did all this, Grandpa?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Grandpa Joe winked. "Just helping the man get acquainted with his new smart features. Thought he'd appreciate the innovation." Maxwell, having failed to control his systems, finally decided on the most drastic measure. He rushed to his main electrical panel and, with a furious grunt, flipped the main breaker. The roar of the pool pump died, the sprinklers ceased their errant spray, and the floodlights mercifully extinguished, plunging his property back into relative darkness. But the silence that followed was heavy with his humiliation. He stood there, panting, amidst his now dark and quiet house, looking like a defeated general on a ravaged battlefield. He glared across at the Miller household, where a single unlit porch swing held a figure that now seemed to possess an almost supernatural calm. He knew instinctively that this chaos was connected to them. He just couldn't prove it. Not yet. He had threatened them with fines, with lawsuits, with financial ruin. He had expected them to cower, to beg for mercy. Instead, they had responded with an escalating series of infuriating, untraceable acts of chaos that struck at the very core of his identity. The gravel was a direct hit. The smart home sabotage was psychological warfare. The cost of this new repair would be astronomical, likely requiring professional IT forensics to even diagnose, and the sheer frustration was already eating away at him. Maxwell, defeated and bewildered, retreated into his now silent, dark home, a man who had lost control of his own domain. The morning, which had started with his rage, ended with his utter bewilderment and profound humiliation. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about pride, about power, and about the growing, terrifying realization for Richard Maxwell that he was up against an adversary far more cunning and resourceful than he could ever have imagined. The next move, he knew, would have to be decisive, because Grandpa Joe was clearly just warming up. The silence that descended upon Richard Maxwell's house after he flipped the main breaker was not peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a man on the brink. His smart home, a fortress of automation, had been reduced to a dark, inert monument to his own impotence. He stood there, panting in the pre-dawn gloom, surrounded by the remnants of his technological rebellion. The still damp pool, the gravel he'd just paid thousands to remove, now returning via his own miswired sprinklers. The chilling silence of his overcooled, unlit mansion. His carefully constructed world of order had been shattered, not by a natural disaster, but by the cunning, untraceable hand of an old man who sat calmly on his porch swing, sipping coffee. Maxwell's humiliation was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He had sought to punish the Millers, to assert his dominance through petty regulations and financial threats. Instead, he had become the neighborhood's unwitting clown, the target of an escalating, unseen war waged by a geriatric saboteur. The police had been useless. His lawyer, Mr. Sterling, while threatening lawsuits, had offered no immediate solutions for the bewildering technological chaos. "This isn't over," Maxwell seethed, his voice a low growl in the stillness. "Not by a long shot." He wasn't just angry, he was vengeful. This wasn't about gravel or offense anymore. This was personal. This was about his reputation, his control, his very standing as the undisputed king of Willow Creek Estates. The next morning, Maxwell initiated his most devastating attack yet. He called an emergency HOA board meeting, bypassing normal procedures, with a ferocity that startled even his most loyal cronies. The agenda was simple: the Miller problem. He presented the board with a meticulously documented and heavily exaggerated account of the Millers' alleged infractions: the unauthorized landscaping material, the gravel, the intentional destruction of common property, his pool, and the malicious tampering with essential community utilities, the smart home chaos, which he blamed on a general unspecified interference without mentioning his own property. He produced Mr. Sterling's demand letter for $15,000, along with estimates for the additional damages from the smart home sabotage, totaling another $10,000 for forensic IT specialists and electrical repairs. He demanded that the HOA take immediate and decisive action. His proposal was brutal, not just the existing fines, but a motion to revoke the Millers' HOA membership, effectively forcing them to sell their home. Failing that, he pushed for an immediate special assessment on all homeowners in the cul-de-sac to cover the damages caused by the Millers' egregious behavior, a thinly veiled attempt to turn the entire neighborhood against them. The Millers received the emergency meeting. Notice that afternoon, Sarah read it aloud, her voice trembling, her hands shaking. "Revoke our membership? Force us to sell? This is insane, Tom. He can't do this." Tom, his face pale, shook his head. "He's the president, Sarah, and he's got the board wrapped around his finger. He'll frame it as protecting property values, community standards. He's trying to make us pariahs." Despair, colder and more paralyzing than before, settled over them. This was beyond a petty neighborly spat. This was an existential threat. Grandpa Joe, observing their panic, remained silent for a long moment. He watched their faces, seeing the return of the fear that had spurred his actions. He'd made his point with the gravel, with the smart home. But Maxwell, he realized, wasn't just a bully. He was a manipulator, a man who understood the power of collective fear and bureaucratic leverage. He was fighting with rules and paperwork, weapons Grandpa Joe rarely used. "He's playing a different game now," Grandpa Joe rumbled, his voice low. "He's trying to make you outcast, make you disappear." He paused, a new resolve hardening his eyes. "Can't let him do that. Not to my family." He stood up and walked to the phone, a rotary relic still connected to the wall. He began dialing numbers from an old leather-bound address book he kept in his coat pocket. Numbers of old friends, long-forgotten acquaintances, people he had helped or argued with over the decades. He spoke in hushed tones, cryptic phrases, occasionally chuckling softly. Sarah and Tom exchanged confused glances, but decided not to interrupt his mysterious communications. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the community clubhouse. Maxwell arrived early, impeccably dressed, a smug look of pre-victory on his face. The meeting room was packed, not just with board members, but with an unusual number of residents, drawn by the escalating drama and Maxwell's urgent, alarmist email about unprecedented threats to our community's harmony and financial stability. Tom and Sarah arrived, their faces grim, trying to project a calm they didn't feel. Grandpa Joe walked in with them, leaning slightly on Tom's arm, looking frail but his eyes still sharp. Maxwell began the meeting with a lengthy, impassioned monologue, painting the Millers as rogue elements, as threats to the very fabric of Willow Creek Estates. He detailed the damages, presented the lawyer's letter, and spun a narrative of victims, himself, and aggressors, the Millers. He then moved to present his motions, the revocation of their membership, the special assessment, just as he called for a vote. A hand shot up in the back of the room. It was Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman who rarely spoke above a whisper, known for her prize-winning rose garden. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "I have a question about the gravel." Maxwell stiffened. "The gravel has been addressed, Mrs. Henderson. It was removed at great expense due to the Millers' negligence." "No, not that gravel," she said. "The gravel you dumped on their property yesterday, the one you said was for common area maintenance. I saw the truck, Mr. Maxwell. It was a huge load. And then I saw your pool this morning. It seems some of the gravel was returned." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Maxwell's face flushed. "That is entirely irrelevant, Mrs. Henderson. A separate issue of vandalism." "Is it?" Another voice chimed in. It was Mr. Peterson, a retired contractor known for his gruff honesty. "I've been trying to get a load of common area gravel for the path near the tennis courts for 6 months, Mr. Maxwell. You said there was no budget? Now suddenly there's a 10-yard load just appearing out of nowhere?" He cast a knowing glance at the Millers. "Seems awfully convenient it landed right there, just before their patio project was to start." A few more voices joined in, emboldened. Mrs. Chang, who had witnessed the initial gravel dumping from her kitchen window, recounted Maxwell's smug demeanor. Mr. Davies, who had just had a minor disagreement with Maxwell over a tree trimming permit, questioned the emergency nature of the meeting. Maxwell, losing control of the narrative, pounded his gavel. "Order! Order! These are unsubstantiated accusations, personal vendettas." Then a familiar figure shuffled to the front of the room. Grandpa Joe, leaning heavily on a cane, slowly approached the podium. The room quieted, a collective curiosity settling over the assembly. He ignored Maxwell's furious glare and instead looked out at the faces of his neighbors, many of whom he'd known for years. "Richard Maxwell, he's a man who likes things tidy," Grandpa Joe began, his voice surprisingly clear, though a little raspy. "He likes his rules, his power. He likes to push folks around." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the board members, some of whom visibly squirmed under his steady stare. "He dumped 10 yards of gravel on my grandkids' land, right where they were going to build their patio. Said it was common area, but we all know different." He then detailed the events of the past few days, from Maxwell's initial act of malice, through the HOA's stonewalling, to the exorbitant demands for compensation. He didn't accuse, he simply presented the facts, quietly, methodically. He described the desperate fear Sarah and Tom had felt, the financial ruin hanging over them. "I tried to give him back his gravel," Grandpa Joe said, a faint smile touching his lips. "But he didn't like it. Cost him a pretty penny to get it out. Now he wants you all to pay for it with a special assessment. And he wants to throw my grandkids out of their home." He then looked at Maxwell, his eyes unwavering. "Richard, you want to talk about community standards? What about integrity? What about being a good neighbor? You want to enforce rules? Start with yourself." Then came the unexpected twist. And speaking of common area, I happen to know there's about 6 cubic yards of common area gravel currently sitting in Mr. Maxwell's backyard, neatly piled, ready for the landscaping project that he's been putting off for 6 months. He gestured, vaguely towards Maxwell's property. The same common area gravel he claimed was dumped on my property. So which is it, Richard? Is it common area, or is it mine to deal with? Maxwell's jaw dropped. The gravel he'd paid to have removed from his pool had indeed been neatly piled in his backyard by the cleanup crew, awaiting transport for official common area use, something he'd been planning to do discreetly. Grandpa Joe had not only exposed his hypocrisy, but had framed it perfectly. The room erupted. Whispers turned to outright grumbling. Residents began to question Maxwell's motives, his abuse of power. The board members, sensing a shift in the tide, suddenly looked less inclined to blindly follow their president. A new voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the din. "Richard Maxwell, I move for a vote of no confidence in your presidency." It was Mrs. Albright, a long-standing board member who had always been quietly